Welcome to Chroma Talk. The Chroma Talk is called "Why Doesn't God Get Rid of Evil?" And yes, we're going to talk about this question, and it is a very difficult question. Many people have asked this question over the centuries, so I'll do my best to try to answer it. But these answers are, just possible answers.
Mhm.
So let's get into the talk then. So here's an example of evil. In 1755, there's an event called the Lisbon earthquake, and it was one of the worst earthquakes in history, actually. So this earthquake, this is before they had instruments to measure the severity of it, but they're estimating it was like something like 8.5 on the Richter scale. Anyway, 50,000 people, men, women, and children were killed in this earthquake. So there was the initial earthquake, and then there was even the fire that happened afterward, and then all the trouble that came after that. So terrible incident. And this is an example of natural evil. Natural evil. Um, More recently, there was the Bosnian War, which involved Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia. This happened from 1992 to 1995, and it was one of the most brutal wars in recent history. There was just something about this particular conflict that was so brutal because it was mixed up with ethnic cleansing and genocide. So the UN estimates that 100,000 people died in this conflict, and many of them were children. Many of them were children. Not only that, but 2.2 million people were displaced. So we had it precipitated a huge refugee crisis as well, and there was a untold suffering, pain and suffering that came as a result of that as well. And also, like I said, there was something very brutal about this war, and so 50,000 people, women, are estimated to have been raped in this war. And there's lots of other stories of infanticide and just acts of cruelty that happened during this war. So this is an example of moral evil. That's different from natural evil. Moral evil that's initiated by human beings, but evil nonetheless. So when these kinds of terrible events happen, there are certain cries of the heart that naturally rise up. And so a lot of times people ask the question, where was God? Where was God in all this? Where was God during the Lisbon earthquake when 50,000 people, including innocent children, were killed? Where was God during the Bosnian War? Why did he allow this to happen? Uh, if you have this idea that God is all powerful and in control, then why did he allow it to happen? Did he not have the power to prevent it? And so there can be a lot of anger toward God. And that can lead to the ultimate question, which is, why does evil even exist? Why is there evil in the first place? Why does there have to be so much evil in the world? When we look around, we see so much evil. So why couldn't it be that the world was a place that had just a little bit of evil? Why so much of it? And so these are the kind of cries that people often lift up when they see this magnitude of evil, pain, and suffering. So formally, this question is called the problem of evil, or the question of evil, but I think it's more commonly referred to as the problem of evil. So to put it formally, it says, if God is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, why doesn't he destroy or prevent all evil right now? Why doesn't he do that? So that is the question. And this is a question that, yes, religious people, people of faith, think about and wrestle with. It's also a question that non-religious people think about. Atheists, they think about this question a lot, and they use this question as an argument against God. They use this argument to prove that God doesn't exist. Because how could God exist if there's this much evil in the world? At least the Judeo-Christian notion of God. So that's how the question is typically stated. And so I think it's helpful to break this question down so we can see the different parts of it and we can understand how the argument goes. Here's the breakdown of the problem of evil. So there's a number of premises leading to a number of conclusions. So the first premise is that if God exists, then he has the desire and the ability to destroy all evil, if God exists. And we're again talking about the Judeo-Christian, the traditional concept of God being all wise, all powerful, all loving, all good, right? Next premise says evil exists. And that is certainly true. I don't know many people who would argue against that premise. But here's one conclusion that comes from it. Therefore, God either does not desire to or is not able to destroy all evil, since evil still exists. Fair conclusion to make, seemingly. And the last conclusion is, therefore, God does not exist. If evil exists, then the classical notion of God cannot coexist with it. So this is how the argument is often broken down. Now, there are different versions of this argument. This is just one version of it. There are some versions that are simpler, some versions that are more complex and more robust. But this is a common form of it. So, yeah, when you look at it this way, it seems like a pretty ironclad, tight argument. And it seems like, how do you argue against this? It just seems to make a lot of sense. And so, yes, Christian thinkers have thought about it. And, while there's no proof out there that's like, a absolute slam dunk, argument that puts everything to rest, there are good arguments to be made against this line of attack. So I'm going to present now 3 possible arguments, and they have their strengths and weaknesses, but these are three good ones. Here's solution number 1. Solution number 1 is to actually change the breakdown of the problem. Change the breakdown. So we'll keep the first premise the same. So the first premise the same. If God exists, then he has the desire and the ability to destroy all evil. We'll keep that because that is essentially true. That this is in agreement with what the Bible says, what the Judeo-Christian faith says about God. He has the desire to destroy all evil because he is good. He also has the ability to destroy all evil because he's all powerful. So nothing wrong with this. Second premise, we'll keep that one as well. Evil exists. Now, in the original problem, it says that God does not have the desire or he doesn't have the ability since evil exists. That is not the only conclusion that we have to jump to. Here is another possible conclusion. So this point number 3 is different from what it was in the previous slide. God has a plan to destroy all evil eventually and has good reason for allowing it to exist today. This is another possible conclusion that you can make. You don't have to conclude that, oh, God doesn't care about evil, he doesn't want to destroy it. Because here's the thing, if God doesn't have a desire to destroy all evil, then that means God cannot be good. And if God doesn't have the ability to destroy all evil, then God cannot be all powerful. But you don't have to go there. This conclusion is a sound conclusion. It's valid. God has a plan to destroy all evil eventually and has good reason for allowing it to exist today. So all we need to do is recognize the possibility that there might be a good enough reason in the mind of God to allow evil to exist. We don't need to know what that reason is. This is a very important point. We don't need to know what the reason is. We only need to recognize that it's possible that God could have a very good reason in his mind to allow evil to exist. And that's all that's really necessary for this argument to work. And so the fourth point, the final conclusion is, therefore God does exist, or he very well can exist. There's nothing in the way of his existence, at least for us to believe in his existence. So this is, I think, a good argument to make. And yes, a lot of Christian scholars, philosophers, theologians, they do make this argument. This is how they explain it to many people. Now, here's the thing about this particular solution. It's not very satisfying. It's not very emotionally satisfying, and in some cases, not very intellectually satisfying because it's based on this hypothetical, right? So, is it possible that God has this amazing reason in his mind to allow evil to exist? I think a reasonable person would be forced to say, yes, it's possible. And so therefore, we have to allow for the existence of God. But it's not very satisfying, right? So that's kind of a weakness of this. It also, is kind of like a blanket argument that just covers everything. So no matter how much evil we see, no matter how many disasters we see, we could always just go to this and say, well, God has a reason. And so for that reason, it's not the most satisfying answer. Here is some scriptural support for the answer. So Job 38, verses 1 to 4. This is after Job cried out to God and made some complaints. And then God finally responds to Job. This is what God says. The Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. He said, "Who is this who obscures my counsel with ignorant words? Get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." And then God goes on and on for actually a couple chapters. Basically, God is saying, your intellect is nothing compared to mine. You have seen nothing compared to what I've seen. That's God's answer. Also, Isaiah 55, verse 9 says, "For as heaven is higher than earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And this is an understatement, right? God's ways are way, way higher than our ways, and his thoughts are way, way infinitely higher than our thoughts. So this is really an understatement, but it's the truth, and that's what the Bible tells us. So we have to admit that it's very possible that God has good reasons to allow evil to exist. Okay, so that's solution number one. It works, but not the most satisfying solution. So let's take a look at the next solution then. Solution number two to the problem of evil, we can call it the freedom defense. The freedom defense. So in this freedom defense, there are four possible worlds. In world A, only good can exist. So only good is possible. But that means there's no freedom because we have no freedom to choose. We're basically forced to choose good, and we're forced to do good all the time. We have no choice in that. So only good can exist, but there's no freedom. So is that really good? Whatever good exists in world A, is that really good when it's forced? And I think a lot of us would doubt that, right? Even, on an everyday level, if someone is forced to love us, or if they are forced to be nice to us, is that real? I think a lot of us would doubt that it's real. So freedom seems to be very important to goodness. It seems to be a necessary element to goodness. So that's world A. World B, only evil can exist. Only evil can exist. Now, that sounds like a terrible world. And out of the four worlds, this is probably the worst world, right? Where only evil can exist. So we have no choice but to commit evil. So here, there is no freedom and there is no good. No freedom and no good. So that's not a world we want to live in. World C, neither good nor evil exists. Neither good nor evil. So I suppose there is freedom. You can do whatever you want, but whatever you do has no moral consequence. So there's no good in this world. And that's also not a desirable world. It's not an ideal world in any sense. And I think that's common sense. It's self-evident. You can see that right away. So that leaves us with the final option, world B. In world B, both good and evil can exist. And there's freedom to choose between the two. And when you have the freedom to choose between the two, then you have the possibility for real good. Real good. But unfortunately, that also creates the possibility for real evil. Out of these four worlds, I think you can make an argument that world D is the best kind of world, because only world D has true goodness in it. True goodness, because there's freedom, freedom of choice. And I believe that the testimony of Scripture is that God chose to create our world as world D. That's what Genesis tells us. That's what the Bible tells us, that God created the world as world D with the possibility of both good and evil. And that's why God put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. That tree represented choice, and it represents freedom. That's how important freedom is to God, and that's how closely linked freedom and goodness are. So here's the image of the Garden of Eden. And then there's that fateful moment when they chose to disobey God and listen to the serpent. Think about it. Only in world B can good things exist, truly good things, such as love. Love is the greatest of all good things. Love is the greatest of all virtues. But true love could only exist in world D, where there's freedom of choice. Someone has to choose to love. Also, courage. How can you have courage unless there was evil to battle, unless there was a problem to overcome? You don't need courage in a world that's all good. You don't need courage in a world where there's no freedom. Sacrifice, faithfulness, loyalty, hope. Hope is a big one. How can you have hope in a world that's either all good or all evil or has no good and evil? No, hope can only exist in world D. So all of these wonderful things that we believe are essential to life can only exist in world D. So that is why evil exists. That is why God allows evil to exist, because he values freedom. And any other world we can see by comparison is a much less ideal world than the one we're living in now. So that is called the freedom defense. And there is some scriptural support for this as well. Let's take a look. There's other verses, but I only put this one up. Romans 5, 3-5. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So here we see both the mix of good and evil. So we see that word suffering in verse 3. Suffering is a result of evil, right? Without evil, there's no suffering. So you have evil, but look what it produces. It produces perseverance, which is a good thing. It produces character, Christ-like character, which is one of the best things in the world. We are all called to develop Christ-like character, and and get this, Christ-like character cannot be produced apart from suffering. Suffering is the means through which Christ-like character is forged in our hearts. So Christ-like character can only be forged in world D. And then hope, like we talked about. So these are all wonderful things that could only exist if God gave us freedom and allowed for the existence of evil. So that's the freedom defense. And that one is, I would say, has more weight than the first one. But all of these answers go hand in hand and they support each other. And so, once we see all three answers, I think it makes a fairly strong case, a cumulative case when we put them together. So this one has a bit more weight and has, I think, more relevance to us, and in terms of understanding why evil exists today. Now, here's the third solution. This one's a little different. This solution I'm calling transfer the burden. Transfer the burden. And so what I mean by this is atheists often put the burden on Christians or on religious people to try to prove, why God can exist when evil is out there in the world. So they put that burden on us. But actually, we can put that burden back on them, on the atheists or the non-religious people. Because is the world is the question of evil easier to answer if you remove God from the equation? And actually, no, it isn't. So on the slide, I have the words, removing God from the equation doesn't solve the problem of evil. It doesn't. It actually makes it worse. It actually makes it worse. So let's take a look. In what way does it make it worse? Well, how do you define good and evil? How do you define it? How do you define good and evil without God? Many attempts have been made to define evil apart from God. Some people have tried to use politics. Some people have tried to use evolution. They tried to use, feelings or your conscience. They tried to use culture. Many people have tried many different ways to try to define good and evil apart from God, but all of those ways fail. All of those ways fail because they have no foundation. You can't say that politics or the government defines good and evil. You can't say that because the government is not always right. In fact, governments are very often wrong. And one of the clearest examples of that is the German government in the 1930s and the 1940s. A very clear example. You can look at the American government in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. They were wrong on major issues. So you can't look to the government to define what good and evil is. You can't look to culture because there's a lot of messed up and evil things in culture. You can't look to evolution because evolution is just this very random process that has no real moral direction. It's just completely random. We, according to evolution, we happened to turn out the way we did, but there was every chance that we could have turned out like a different kind of creature with different kinds of habits and different kinds of needs, and therefore a different kind of morality, right? We turned out a certain way, but according to evolution, that was by chance. And we could have turned out like lizard people. We could have turned out like insect people. We could have turned out to have a very different physiology with a very different morality. So how do you ground morality? That's the issue. How do you ground what's good and evil? You can't do that apart from God. So here's the conclusion. Without God, evil, quote unquote, evil acts and evil events are not evil, but they are morally neutral. It means that they just are. Okay? Evil acts and evil beings and evil events, they just are. They're not evil, they're not good, they just exist. That's the inevitable conclusion if you take God out of the equation. And that creates a big conundrum. Think about the most atrocious events in the history of the world. And we can come up with 100, we can come up with 1,000 examples, but I'll just come up with probably one of the most obvious examples, which is the Holocaust. One of the most evil, atrocious, um, abominable events in the history of humankind, led by that man in the corner, Adolf Hitler, and you can see some prisoners there, and they're gaunt and they're skeletal because they've been starved and tortured. And in the upper left, you can see a picture of all the shoes that were collected from the victims at Auschwitz. Thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes. That's how many Jews were killed, 6 million Jews. In the upper right, you can see the gas chamber that they used to exterminate these human beings as if they were vermin. This is evil. And how can you call it anything else? If this isn't evil, then what is? But if you take God out of the equation, then you have no grounding for good and evil, no definition for good and evil, and then you're forced to conclude that all of this, the Holocaust, is. It's not evil. It just happened. It's just Hitler is not an evil person. He's just a person who followed his genetic programming, who just made certain choices based on logic, and there's no good and evil value that you can assign to any of this. That's a problem. That's a problem for the atheist. That's a problem for the non-religious person. And the burden is on them to explain this. So that's solution number 3. As Christians, as believers in God, we have a way to explain this. We have a foundation upon which we can stand and say, this is evil. We can clearly point at this and say, yep, that's evil. Not only that, but we have a moral duty and a mandate to fight against this kind of evil. But when you take morality out and you can't say that this is evil, then you also lose the motivation to fight against this. Why fight against something that just is? Right? If it's not evil, if Hitler is not an evil man, why resist him? He's just following his genetic programming and just doing what he was just, thought to do according to his brain chemistry and the way he was raised, right? So the burden is on the non-religious person to explain, why is this evil and why should we fight against it? And they usually have a very difficult time to explain it. So here are the notes that I have on this screen. Without God, there is no reason to combat evil, and only the Judeo-Christian faith provides compelling reasons to combat evil in the world. I'm not going to talk too much about the other world religions, but if you take a look at other world religions such as Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, they have a much weaker case to fight against evil. There is a concept of good and evil, but the way that they frame it is very different from the Judeo-Christian understanding of good and evil. So only the Judeo-Christian worldview gives compelling reason to identify evil and to fight against it. And that's a whole other topic that could take an hour to talk about right there. That's it. Those are the 3 solutions. And so to summarize, the problem that we talked about was, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, why doesn't he destroy or prevent all evil right now? Good question. And so there were 3 answers that we talked about. The first answer was, God has a plan to destroy all evil eventually. He will, and he has good reasons for allowing it to exist now. The second answer was, only in a world where people are free to choose between good and evil can real good, real love, real freedom exist. And so it is the best of all possible worlds. And the third answer is a world without God is less able to explain evil, less able. So God actually is the best answer to evil there is. He is the best answer. You take God out, it's virtually impossible. It's very, very difficult to explain what evil is and why we should even fight against it. So that's the main presentation. I'm just going to leave all of you with a final screen. These are some questions for further consideration. I'm not going to answer them, but if you would like to talk about them, I'm happy to sit down and talk about these questions with you at a later time. So um, the first question is, can the death of innocent children ever be truly justified by a greater good? So the first solution that I presented is that God has a, a good reason in his mind to allow for this evil to happen. Okay, that's logical, but could there really be a good enough reason to justify the death of innocent children? What could that reason possibly be? That's a that's a fair question. It's a difficult question. Another one is, isn't the standard of does it cause harm to others? Isn't that a good enough explanation for evil? So atheists, they're trying to come up with their own standard and definition of evil. And one of the more promising ones is this standard here. Does it cause harm to others? Does it hurt another person? So that standard doesn't require God. You don't need God according to that standard. So could that standard be a foundation upon which to build a system of good and evil? It sounds promising. And of course, many non-religious people do believe that this is a standard, that this is a better standard than God for explaining good and evil. Um, and of course, a lot of discussion going on about that. And the third one is, if God created the world knowing that evil would exist, isn't he the author of evil? Isn't God ultimately the author and the creator of evil if he created the world uh, in such a way that evil would exist? Doesn't that make God evil? Great questions. But again, um, beyond the scope of our short little presentation today. So if you'd like to talk about any of those questions, I'm happy to talk about them with you. But for now, I just want to thank you all for attending and hope everyone learned something from this. Thank you. All right.